The air in the Senate Appropriations Committee hearing room was thick with anticipation. Television cameras lined the back wall, their red recording lights glowing like predatory eyes. Staff members whispered urgently into phones. Reporters sat poised, fingers hovering over keyboards. Everyone knew something was about to happen. They just didn't know what. Congresswoman Maxine Waters strode to the witness table with the confidence of a woman who had spent 3 decades in Washington mastering the art of political theater. Her purple suit was impeccable, her hair styled to perfection. Behind her walked 3 aides carrying briefcases and folders. Her communications director was already positioning himself in the gallery, phone ready to capture content for social media. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a performance, and Maxine Waters had come prepared to put on a show. Senator John Kennedy sat at the elevated dais, partially obscured by a stack of manila folders. His reading glasses sat crooked on his nose. His brown suit looked like it had been purchased sometime during the Reagan administration and forgotten in a closet until this morning. A yellow legal pad sat before him, covered in what appeared to be absent-minded doodles. To anyone watching, he looked like exactly what Waters had come to mock, a country lawyer who'd accidentally stumbled into the United States Senate. But appearances, as they say, can be deceiving. The hearing was supposed to address routine oversight of the House Financial Services Committee, which Waters chaired. Standard procedure. Boring testimony. Maybe a few softball questions from friendly senators. Maybe a couple of pointed inquiries from Republicans that Waters would easily deflect. It should have been over in an hour, forgotten by lunch, ignored by the evening news. Waters had other plans. "Senator Kennedy," she began, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. "With all due respect, which is none, you sit there with your fake country boy act and your fake Oxford degree, pretending to be some simple lawyer from the bayou." The room went silent, cameras zoomed in, reporters stopped typing. This was no longer a routine hearing. Waters leaned forward, her finger jabbing the air like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "You represent the poorest state in America because you keep them poor and ignorant with your votes." That ridiculous drawl. "We all know you went to Vanderbilt and Oxford. Stop insulting our intelligence by cosplaying as some plantation overseer who stumbled into the Senate." Her supporters in the gallery erupted in applause. Her communications director was already typing furiously, crafting tweets with hashtags ready to go viral. Maxine drags Kennedy. Bayou Faker exposed. The social media campaign was launching in real time. Waters continued, her voice rising with theatrical indignation. "I've been fighting for the people since before you figured out which fork to use at your fancy Oxford dinners. I grew up poor, one of 13 children raised by a single mother in St. Louis. I worked in garment factories and as a telephone operator. I know what real struggle is." She turned to face the gallery, playing to her audience like a seasoned performer. "This man represents Louisiana, 49th out of 50 states in poverty, education, healthcare, and he has the audacity to question me about financial services. I chair the committee that oversees the entire financial industry. I've served in Congress for 33 years. I've chaired the Congressional Black Caucus." More applause. Waters basked in it. Kennedy sat quietly, occasionally jotting something on his legal pad. His expression was one of mild confusion, almost befuddlement. He looked, for all the world, like a man who had wandered into the wrong room and wasn't quite sure what was happening. "Senator Kennedy," Waters continued, her tone shifting to mock sympathy, "maybe you're just confused. Maybe all that catfish and crawfish has clogged up your thinking. So let me speak slowly so you can understand. I fight for the people." "What do you fight for?" "Tax cuts for the rich, oil companies. You're a walking stereotype of everything wrong with the South." Chairman Lindsey Graham tapped his gavel weakly. "Congresswoman Waters, if you could please maintain decorum." "I'm answering the senator's questions," Waters snapped back. "Or I would be if he could formulate a coherent question beyond 'well now' and 'I reckon.'" The insult drew gasps even from some Democrats in the room. But Waters was rolling now, high on her own performance, feeding off the energy of her supporters packed into the gallery. Her social media team was capturing everything. Every barb, every eye roll, every dismissive gesture. This was the content they'd been waiting for. Maxine Waters, champion of the people, taking down a privileged white Southern senator who dared to question her. You know what I think? Waters leaned forward, staring directly at Kennedy. I think you resent powerful black women. I think you can't stand that someone like me, someone who actually pulled herself up by her bootstraps instead of inheriting a law practice, has real power in Washington. You probably thought you could intimidate me with this little hearing, make me look small. Well, Senator, I don't get small. I get loud. Throughout this tirade, Kennedy had continued his doodling, occasionally looking up with an expression that suggested he was trying very hard to follow along but wasn't quite managing. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old pocket watch, checking the time with deliberate, almost comical care. Are you even listening to me? Waters demanded. Or are you just waiting for your afternoon nap? Kennedy looked up, his eyes twinkling behind those reading glasses. Oh, I'm listening, Congresswoman. I'm listening real careful. He set the pocket watch down next to a manila folder that had been sitting on his desk all along. The folder was thick, bulging with documents. Someone with sharp eyes might have noticed the neat handwriting on the tab. M. Waters' financial investigation. For the first time since she'd started speaking, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Waters' face. It was brief, barely noticeable, gone in an instant, but it was there. Now, Congresswoman, Kennedy said, his voice still soft and folksy, you mentioned you've been fighting for the people for a long time. That's mighty admirable. And you chair that important financial services committee. That's a powerful position. That's right, Waters said, recovering her composure, her chin lifting defiantly. And I use that power to help working families, unlike some people in this room. So maybe you could help this simple country lawyer understand something. Kennedy continued, opening the folder with careful, almost loving precision. Because I've been doing a little research of my own. The room shifted. Experienced reporters leaned forward. They'd covered Kennedy before. They'd seen him play this role. The bumbling country lawyer who turns out to be anything but bumbling. It was a routine he'd perfected over decades, first as a prosecutor, then as a litigator, now as a senator. The accent got thicker, the demeanor got simpler, the questions got more basic, and then suddenly, like a trap springing shut, the razor-sharp mind would reveal itself. Waters didn't see it coming. She was too intoxicated by her own performance, too convinced of her own superiority, too certain that she was the smartest person in the room. You mentioned you grew up poor, Kennedy said, pulling out the first document from his folder. And I respect that. I truly do. Hard work and determination. That's the American dream right there. He paused, looking up at her with those twinkling eyes. So maybe you could explain to this confused country boy how someone who fights so hard for the poor lives in a $4.5 million house in Hancock Park. He held up a photograph, an aerial shot. A mansion with 6 bedrooms, a pool, a separate guest house, manicured lawns, privacy walls, the kind of house that screamed wealth. Waters's face went from triumphant to tight in an instant. That's none of your business, Senator. My personal finances are. And that's just where we're starting, Congresswoman, Kennedy said, his drawl somehow becoming both gentler and more dangerous. See, you mentioned my fake Oxford degree. Well, let me tell you something about Oxford. They teach you to read real careful, to follow the money, to ask simple questions. He tapped the folder. And I've got a whole lot of simple questions about your finances, your family, your bank dealings, and your friends in Cuba who kill police officers. The gallery erupted. Waters' staff was frantically whispering to her. Her social media coordinator had stopped filming. The hashtags that were supposed to go viral were being deleted. The narrative was collapsing in real time. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his folksy demeanor firmly in place. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with something simple. Let's talk about a bank called One United. You remember One United, don't you, Congresswoman? The smile had completely vanished from Waters' face. The confidence was gone. The theatrical indignation had evaporated. In that instant, the hunter realized she had just become the prey. If you're not already subscribed to this channel, hit that subscribe button now. because what comes next is going to shock you. This is the story of how a so-called champion of the poor got exposed for enriching her family through corruption, how decades of political theater couldn't hide the truth, and how one senator from Louisiana dismantled a career built on lies. This is the story of Maxine Waters versus John Kennedy. Kennedy removed his reading glasses and cleaned them slowly with a handkerchief he'd pulled from his pocket. It was a deliberate gesture, theatrical in its own way, letting the tension build in the room like pressure in a boiler. When he replaced them on his nose, he looked like a kindly grandfather about to tell a bedtime story. But everyone in that room now understood this was no bedtime story. This was an execution. "Now, Congresswoman," he began, his voice full of gentle confusion that everyone now recognized as calculated strategy. "I'm just a simple lawyer from Louisiana, so maybe you can help me understand this banking thing. It's awful complicated for us country folk." Waters had regained some composure. She straightened in her chair, her lawyer leaning in to whisper urgently in her ear. She waved him off. "Senator, I've spent decades working on financial services legislation. If you have actual questions instead of—" "Oh, I've got questions," Kennedy interrupted mildly, and there was steel beneath that soft drawl now. "Real simple ones. See, back in 2008, during that financial crisis, we had this TARP program, Troubled Asset Relief Program, bailout money for banks that were struggling. You remember that?" "Of course I remember," Waters said, her voice regaining some of its earlier authority. "I was intimately involved in crafting that legislation to help." "To help banks," Kennedy finished for her. "Yes, ma'am. Now, one of those banks was called Uneducated, based in Boston but had operations in Los Angeles. You familiar with Uneducated?" There was a pause. The room was utterly silent. Even the whispers had stopped. "I'm familiar with many minority-owned banks that were struggling during the crisis." "I'm sure you are," Kennedy said agreeably, "but I'm asking specifically about Uneducated. Let me help refresh your memory." He pulled out a document, holding it up so the cameras could see it clearly. "Your husband, Ambassador Sidney Williams, he was on the board of Uneducated from 2004 to 2008. Is that correct?" Waters's jaw tightened. "My husband has had a distinguished career in—" "Just a yes or no would be fine, ma'am. Was he on the board?" "Yes, but—" "And he owned stock in the bank." Kennedy continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Quite a bit of stock, in fact. According to your own financial disclosure forms, between $250,000 and $500,000 worth of stock as of the end of 2007. Does that sound about right?" Waters's lawyer was whispering urgently in her ear again. She ignored him, her face set in hard lines. "My husband's investments are properly disclosed and completely legal." "I'm sure they are," Kennedy said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Now here's what puzzles me. In September 2008, Uneducated was in trouble, real bad trouble. They'd invested heavily in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac stock, and when those companies collapsed, well—" He shrugged, the gesture pure country boy, but his eyes were laser-focused on Waters. "Your husband's investment was heading toward worthless. That $350,000 or so was about to become $0. That's a lot of money to lose, even for folks who aren't poor anymore." He pulled out another document, this one with a series of dates highlighted in yellow. "So on September 9, 2008, you called Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, set up a meeting for September 12th. Now, you told the Treasury this meeting was to discuss problems facing minority-owned banks in general. Is that your recollection?" Waters shifted in her seat. "I have always advocated for minority-owned institutions that face systemic. But here's what's interesting." Kennedy continued as if she hadn't spoken, and this was becoming a pattern now, him asking questions and then answering them himself with documentary evidence. "When that meeting happened, and neither you nor Secretary Paulson attended by the way, the only bank directly represented was Uneducated. Not multiple banks, just Uneducated." He displayed a document on the screen behind him. The video feed showed it clearly. Meeting attendees: Kevin Cohey, CEO of Uneducated; Robert Cooper, attorney for Uneducated; 3 other representatives, all with direct ties to Uneducated. Waters shifted in her seat again, no longer making eye contact with Kennedy, her gaze fixed somewhere over his left shoulder. Now maybe that's coincidence, Kennedy said thoughtfully, his finger tapping the folder as if considering the possibility. But here's what really confuses this simple country lawyer. You had a conversation with Congressman Barney Frank, good man, chairman of the Financial Services Committee at the time. You told him, and I'm quoting from his sworn testimony here, I should say no to helping them because Sydney's been on the board. Kennedy looked up, and for the first time his folksy demeanor cracked just slightly, revealing something colder underneath. So you knew you had a conflict of interest. Congressman Frank even told you, and again I'm quoting directly, it's clearly a conflict of interest problem. Stay out of it. His words, not mine. But you called Secretary Paulson anyway. Why is that? I was representing the interests of all minority banks, Waters said, but her voice had lost its earlier fire. She sounded defensive now, reactive instead of commanding. Were you now? Kennedy pulled out more papers, spreading them across his desk like a card dealer revealing a winning hand. Because in December 2008, One United received $12.1 million in TARP funds. And here's the fascinating part, Congresswoman. I had my staff. Yes, ma'am, even us hillbillies have staff. Analyze all 363 banks that received TARP money in the fourth quarter of 2008. A chart appeared on the screen behind him, color-coded and detailed. One United had the worst Tier 1 capital ratio of any bank that got bailout money, 1.8%. The worst. It was rated less than satisfactory by federal regulators. It had ineffective underwriting standards. It was engaged in speculative investment practices. Kennedy's voice was harder now, the country boy act wearing thinner with each word. By every measure, One United was the least qualified bank to receive taxpayer money. In fact, of all 987 banks that received TARP funds between October 2008 and December 2009, not a single one had a worse financial position than One United when they got their bailout. Not one. Waters tried to interrupt, but Kennedy held up a hand, and something in his expression made her stop. Now, Secretary Paulson said something interesting in his testimony. He said he didn't know about your husband's connection to One United when he approved that meeting. The Treasury officials at the meeting didn't know either. Funny thing about that. Kennedy's folksy demeanor was slipping away now, like a mask being slowly removed, revealing something much sharper underneath. Let's talk about One United's leadership. CEO Kevin Cohey. He had a company-financed Porsche, a Santa Monica beachfront mansion, also company-financed. The bank had squandered $52 million on Fannie and Freddie stock right before they collapsed. But somehow this was the bank that just had to be saved with taxpayer money. He pulled out emails, projecting them on the screen. Here's where it gets really interesting. Your grandson, Mikkel Moore, who also happens to be your chief of staff, he was in contact with One United executives throughout September 2008. He sent them draft TARP legislation. He helped them position for the bailout. One email from One United's counsel to your grandson reads, "Thank you for all your hard work." Kennedy looked directly at Waters, and there was no kindness in that gaze now, no folksy confusion, just prosecutorial focus. Your grandson, your employee, your chief of staff, coordinating a bailout for a bank where your husband was a board member and stockholder. And you expect us to believe you knew nothing about it. Mikkel acted without my direct knowledge on some matters. Waters began, but her voice was weak now, the earlier fire completely extinguished. Ma'am, with respect, Kennedy cut her off. That's not credible. You're one of the smartest, most politically savvy people in Congress. You don't get to chair the Financial Services Committee by being oblivious to what your own chief of staff does, especially when that chief of staff is your grandson. He held up another document, this one with an official seal. The House Ethics Committee charged you with 3 violations in 2010, 3 counts: using your office for personal gain, violating the spirit of House rules, bringing discredit to the House. But here's the fascinating part. Kennedy paused, letting the silence build. The case got delayed, and delayed, and delayed some more. Your colleague, Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, helped stall the investigation, fired 2 attorneys who were building the case against you, And finally, in 2012, you were cleared when a lawyer decided you thought you were helping all minority banks, not just your husband's bank. He spread his hands in a gesture of mock confusion. Never mind that only one United was at the meeting. Never mind the emails. Never mind that your grandson coordinated everything. Never mind that Barney Frank explicitly warned you it was a conflict of interest. You thought wrong, so everything's fine. Kennedy pulled out one more document, this one a bank failure report. One United barely survived even with that $12 million. It eventually got shut down anyway, forced to merge after years of losses. American taxpayers lost every penny of that bailout. But your husband, he got to sell his stock before it became worthless. He salvaged his investment. That's a nice outcome for the Waters family, wouldn't you say? He looked at Waters, who was now gripping the edge of the witness table, her knuckles white. In Louisiana, we have an expression, "Don't piss on my boots and tell me it's raining." The crude language shocked the room. Kennedy never cursed, but he'd done it deliberately, a verbal slap designed to cut through any remaining pretense. You used your congressional power to arrange a bailout for your husband's failing bank. You did it despite being explicitly warned it was a conflict of interest. Your grandson coordinated the whole thing from your congressional office. And when you got caught, you played the race card and said you were just trying to help minority banks. Kennedy's voice was soft again, but deadly serious, each word landing like a hammer blow. That's not helping minorities, Congresswoman. That's helping yourself. And we've got $12 million in taxpayer money that we'll never see again to prove it. Waters tried to respond, but her voice came out barely above a whisper. The Ethics Committee cleared me after a thorough, "Yes, ma'am, they did," Kennedy interrupted. "After you and your allies delayed and obstructed for 2 years. After 2 lead attorneys were fired from the investigation. After the case was reassigned to someone more sympathetic. Your grandson got a letter of reproval, basically a slap on the wrist, and you walked away clean to chair the very committee that's supposed to oversee banks." Kennedy gathered his papers, but he wasn't done. Not even close. "But we're just getting started, Congresswoman, because One United wasn't a one-time thing, was it? It was a pattern. A pattern of your family getting rich off your political position while you lecture everyone else about helping the poor." He opened the second section of his folder, and Waters visibly flinched. "Let's talk about your daughter Corinne and the $1 million campaign scheme, shall we?" Kennedy took a sip of water, his movements deliberate and unhurried, letting the suspense build. The reporters in the gallery were typing so fast their keyboards sounded like rain on a tin roof. Waters' supporters had gone completely quiet. Her social media team had not only stopped posting, they'd started deleting the earlier tweets. The hashtags that were supposed to destroy Kennedy were being scrubbed from existence. "Now, Congresswoman," Kennedy began, his folksy manner returning like an old friend, "you've got a daughter named Corinne Waters. Lovely name. I'm sure she's a fine person. She runs a company called Progressive Connections. Does that sound familiar?" Waters said nothing, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. "Corinne started that company back in 2003. What does Progressive Connections do exactly?" When Waters still didn't answer, Kennedy consulted his notes with exaggerated care. "According to your campaign finance reports, which are public record by the way, Progressive Connections provides slate mailer management services. That's a fancy way of saying they print flyers with your endorsements and mail them out to voters. Pretty simple business, really. My question is, why does it cost so much?" He pulled up Federal Election Commission filings on the screen behind him, the numbers large enough for everyone to see clearly. 2016, your campaign paid Progressive Connections $250,000. 2018, $240,000. 2020, $212,000. 2022, $190,000. Kennedy looked up from his papers, his eyes sharp despite the gentle tone. "That's over $1.2 million paid to your daughter's company from your campaign funds since 2003. In fact, if we go back further, the total exceeds $1.5 million. Waters finally spoke, her voice defensive. Campaign finance experts have reviewed these payments and found them completely legal. Legal? Kennedy repeated, as if tasting the word. Yes, ma'am, I'm not disputing that. What I'm questioning is whether it's ethical. You see, I had my staff research what similar services cost from companies that aren't run by the candidate's daughter. He pulled out more documents, spreading them on his desk. Turns out slate mailer services typically cost about $50,000 to $100,000 per election cycle, depending on volume and district size. Most members of Congress who use these services pay somewhere in that range. Kennedy did the math on screen, showing the calculations clearly. You're paying 2 to 3 times the market rate. And all that extra money, it's going straight to your daughter. Over 20 years, your daughter has become a millionaire by overcharging your campaign for services that other companies provide for a fraction of the cost. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. But here's the really clever part, and I have to admit, it's ingenious in a deeply corrupt sort of way. Most members of Congress raise money from individual donors and PACs. Small dollar contributions, large dollar contributions, all regulated and disclosed. You do something different. Kennedy pulled out another document, this one showing a list of payments. You sell your endorsement. Politicians pay you to endorse them. They don't give money directly to you. That would look bad. Instead, they pay slate mailer fees to be included on your endorsement flyers. Fees ranging from $25,000 to $45,000 per endorsement. He displayed the list on screen. Ed Lee, former San Francisco mayor, $37,000 for your endorsement. Multiple California state candidates, $25,000 each. Congressional candidates, $35,000. Judicial candidates, $20,000. On and on it goes. Kennedy's voice took on an edge. You've created a business model where politicians essentially purchase your endorsement by paying inflated slate mailer fees, which then go to your campaign, which then pays your daughter at inflated rates, and your daughter gets rich. It's money laundering, but it's legal money laundering because you helped write the loopholes. Waters tried to interrupt. This is a gross mischaracterization of. Is it? Kennedy pulled out more documents and Waters fell silent again. Let's talk about your husband's post-government career. Ambassador Sidney Williams, very distinguished man, served as ambassador to the Bahamas from 1994 to 1998. Fine service. After that, he became a consultant. What exactly does he consult on, Congresswoman? Waters's lawyer was gesturing frantically now, but she wasn't looking at him. Her gaze fixed on Kennedy like a deer watching a wolf circle closer. According to publicly available records, Ambassador Williams has had consulting contracts with several firms that have business before the Financial Services Committee, firms that seek regulatory relief, firms that lobby Congress on banking regulations, firms that benefit directly from your votes on the committee you chair. Kennedy displayed a chart showing Williams's consulting clients on one axis and Waters's committee votes on the other, with lines connecting them. Funny thing, almost every time your husband has a consulting relationship with a company, you vote in their favor when their issues come before your committee. Could be coincidence, but it happens an awful lot. 23 times in the last 10 years by my staff's count. He leaned back. And then there's your grandson, Moore. We already talked about his role in the Uneducated scandal, but let's talk about his salary. As your chief of staff, he's one of the highest paid staffers in the entire House of Representatives. Over $170,000 a year. In his career working for you, spanning more than a decade, he's earned over $1.5 million. Kennedy pulled out the House ethics rules, holding up the booklet. Now the House has anti-nepotism rules. You can't hire your spouse. You can't hire your children. You can't hire certain other relatives. But grandchildren, that's the loophole. You can hire your grandson, pay him a premium salary, and have him coordinate deals that benefit your husband's investments. He started adding up the numbers on screen, and the total grew with each line item. Corinne Waters, over $1.5 million in campaign payments. Sidney Williams, estimated $2 million plus in consulting fees from firms you help regulate. Moore, $1.5 million in salary. One United bailout benefit to your husband, at least $350,000 saved from his stock investment. The total appeared at the bottom of the screen. Over $5 million. Your family has extracted more than $5 million through your congressional position, and that's just what we can document publicly. The real number is likely much higher. Kennedy pulled up a map showing California's 43rd Congressional District, South Los Angeles, Inglewood, Gardena, Watts. These are your constituents, Congresswoman. Your constituents have a median household income of $39,000. The poverty rate is 23%. Unemployment is over 12%. There are over 15,000 homeless people sleeping on the streets in your district. He let that sink in, the silence in the room thick and heavy. You lecture everyone about helping the poor. You talk about your humble roots. You attack Republicans for not caring about working families. But while your constituents struggle to pay rent, struggle to feed their children, struggle just to survive, the Waters family gets rich off your congressional position. Kennedy held up a report, turning it so the cameras could see the cover. Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. CREW. Not exactly a right-wing organization. They're a government watchdog group that goes after corruption on both sides of the aisle. He opened the report. They named you one of the most corrupt members of Congress multiple times. 2005, 2006, 2009, 2011. 4 times they called you out. Not once, not twice. 4 separate times over 6 years. Waters tried to speak, but her voice was barely audible. I have devoted my life to public service. Public service that's made your family millionaires, Kennedy said quietly, and somehow the quiet was more devastating than shouting would have been. That's not service, Congresswoman. That's self-service. That's corruption wrapped in the language of social justice. He opened the 3rd section of his folder, and the atmosphere in the room somehow got even heavier. But let's talk about something even more troubling. Let's talk about violence, justice, and your very selective outrage about both. Kennedy's demeanor shifted completely. The folksy mask dropped entirely. What emerged was the Oxford-educated lawyer, the constitutional scholar, the man who'd built a career on meticulous preparation and devastating cross-examination. Congresswoman Waters, you've been very vocal about January 6, 2021. You've called it an insurrection. You've demanded harsh penalties for everyone involved. You've accused Republicans of inciting violence. Is that accurate? January 6th was an attack on our democracy, Waters said, and for a moment some of her earlier fire returned. Yes or no, please? Have you been vocal about January 6th and the concept of incitement? Yes. Good. Kennedy's voice was cold now, prosecutorial. Let's talk about your history with incitement. He pulled up a video clip and Waters visibly tensed. April 17, 2021. Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. Protests over the shooting of Daunt Wright. The Derek Chauvin trial is ongoing. The jury is deliberating. And there you are, Congresswoman, in the middle of it all. The video played. Waters' voice filled the chamber. We've got to stay on the street. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure they know we mean business. Kennedy paused the video. This was during jury deliberations in a murder trial. You traveled to a city in crisis and told protesters to get more confrontational. Buildings were burning. Police were being injured. Stores were being looted. And you told them to get more confrontational. He pulled up another document. Judge Peter Cahill, who presided over the Chauvin trial, had this to say about your comments. I'll read it directly. I wish elected officials would stop talking about this case, especially in a manner that is disrespectful to the rule of law and the judicial branch. A congresswoman's opinion really doesn't matter a whole lot, but the problem is some of these comments give you grounds for an appeal that may result in this whole trial being overturned. Kennedy looked at Waters, and his expression was one of controlled anger. The judge said your comments were abhorrent and nearly caused a mistrial. You attempted to intimidate a jury during deliberations. You called for confrontation while a city was burning. But when protesters you disagree with do something similar, you demand they be jailed for decades. He pulled up more footage, older clips from different years. June 23, 2018. Your comments about Trump administration officials. Let's hear them. Waters' voice again, from years earlier. If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them. Tell them they're not welcome anymore anywhere. Create a crowd and push back, Kennedy repeated, letting each word hang in the air. You called for mob harassment of government officials. You encouraged people to form crowds and confront members of the president's cabinet wherever they went. And what happened? He displayed news headlines from 2018. Sarah Sanders, White House press secretary, kicked out of Red Hen restaurant by owner. Kirstjen Nielsen, Homeland Security secretary, harassed by mob while eating dinner with her staff. Senator Ted Cruz and his wife forced to leave restaurant by angry crowd. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell confronted by mob outside restaurant. Kennedy's voice was hard as steel now. You encouraged this. You weaponized restaurant crowds against people you disagreed with politically. You told your supporters to make these people uncomfortable everywhere they went. And when it worked, when people started getting harassed and driven out of public spaces, you doubled down. You said, and I quote, "Harassment works." He turned to face Waters fully, and there was no trace of the country lawyer now. So let me understand your moral framework, Congresswoman. When you call for people to get confrontational during jury deliberations, that's righteous protest. When you tell supporters to form mobs and harass government officials in restaurants, that's justified resistance. But when people you disagree with enter the Capitol building on January 6th, that's domestic terrorism and insurrection. Waters opened her mouth, but Kennedy wasn't finished. Let's go back further. 1992. Los Angeles riots after the Rodney King verdict. 63 people died, over 2,000 injured, $1 billion in damage, entire neighborhoods burned. And what did you say? He pulled out news clips from 1992, yellowed and aged. You defended the rioters. You said they had a reason to be angry. You led no justice, no peace chants in the streets while buildings burned behind you. When President Bush called the rioters thugs, you said, quote, "It only makes them madder when you call them hoodlums and thugs." Kennedy displayed photos of the devastation. Korean businesses burned to the ground, their owners' life savings destroyed. Reginald Denny, a truck driver, beaten nearly to death by a mob, his skull fractured, his life permanently altered. A city in flames, neighborhoods destroyed, lives shattered. And you provided justification for it. You gave it moral cover. Not once did you apologize. Not once did you say the violence was unacceptable without qualification. He created a side-by-side comparison on the screen, methodical and damning. On one side, Waters' actions over 30 years, called for confrontation during jury deliberations, encouraged harassment of officials in public, defended rioters who caused 63 deaths and $1 billion in damage, led no justice, no peace rallies during active riots, said harassment works. On the other side, January 6th defendants, held in solitary confinement for months without trial, prosecuted for trespassing and parading, called insurrectionists and domestic terrorists, facing decades in prison, denied bail, lives destroyed. You see the problem, Congresswoman. Kennedy's voice was quiet again, but it carried across the room like thunder. People who did far less than what you encouraged are rotting in jail right now. People who never hurt anyone, never burned anything, never caused $1 billion in damage. They're being treated as domestic terrorists while you sit on your committee, enrich your family, and face absolutely no consequences for decades of encouraging the exact behavior you now condemn when it comes from people you disagree with politically. Waters finally found her voice, weak and desperate. I have always fought for justice for marginalized. You fought for selective justice, Kennedy corrected, his tone brooking no argument. Justice for people who agree with you. Harsh punishment for everyone else. That's not justice. That's tyranny. That's the rule of Maxine Waters, not the rule of law. He opened the 4th section of his folder, the thickest one yet. And speaking of selective justice, let's talk about your relationship with cop killers and communist dictators. Kennedy's expression had turned grave. This was no longer about money or hypocrisy. This was about something deeper, something that touched the core of law and order and justice. Congresswoman Waters, let me ask you a simple question. Do you believe in the rule of law? Waters straightened slightly, trying to recover some dignity. Of course I do. Do you believe that people who murder police officers should be brought to justice? What kind of question is that? It's a simple question, Kennedy said, his voice dangerously soft. Yes or no, should cop killers face justice? Yes, but the circumstances. No buts, Kennedy interrupted. Just yes or no. Should cop killers face justice in a fair system? Yes. Kennedy pulled out a photograph, holding it up for the room to see. This is New Jersey State Trooper Werner Forrester, 34 years old, married, father of young children. On May 2, 1973, he and his partner pulled over a vehicle on the New Jersey Turnpike. Inside were members of the Black Liberation Army. A shootout occurred. He pulled out crime scene photos, showing them briefly before putting them face down. They were brutal, and even from a distance, people in the gallery could see they depicted violence. Trooper Forrester was shot execution style at point-blank range while he lay wounded on the ground. One of the shooters was Joanne Chesimard, also known as Assata Shakur. She was captured, tried, and convicted of first-degree murder in 1977, sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. Kennedy paused, letting the weight of that sink in. In 1979, members of the Black Liberation Army broke her out of prison in a violent escape that left guards injured. She fled to Cuba, where Fidel Castro gave her political asylum. She's been living there for over 40 years. She's on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. There's a $2 million reward for information leading to her capture. She is a wanted fugitive for the murder of a law enforcement officer. He looked directly at Waters and his eyes were hard as flint. And you visited her multiple times. The room gasped audibly. Kennedy pulled out travel records, customs documents, photographs. You've made multiple trips to Cuba over the years, and several of those trips included meetings with Assata Shakur. In 1998, you wrote a letter to Fidel Castro, not asking him to return this fugitive to face justice, not expressing concern for Trooper Forrester's family who have spent 50 years without closure. No, you asked Castro not to extradite her. You called her a political activist. You described her as someone fleeing political persecution. He read from Waters' letter, his voice dripping with barely controlled contempt. I am writing to urge you not to extradite Assata Shakur to the United States. As you know, she has been targeted by the U.S. government for her political beliefs and activism. Kennedy set down the letter with a deliberate movement. Political beliefs, political activism. She executed a state trooper. She shot him while he lay wounded and helpless on the ground. She was convicted by a jury of her peers. She exhausted all her appeals. Every court that reviewed her case upheld the conviction. And you call her a political activist being persecuted for her beliefs. He pulled up a photograph of Trooper Forrester's widow and children, a family portrait taken before his murder. Rose Marie Forrester raised her children without their father because your friend murdered him. Those children, now adults in their 50s, grew up without a dad because Assata Shakur shot him execution style. And you use your congressional platform to protect their father's killer. Kennedy's voice was shaking slightly with controlled anger. The New Jersey State Police Benevolent Association has condemned you repeatedly. Trooper Forrester's family has begged for justice for 50 years. And you, a member of Congress, you use your position to lobby a foreign dictator to keep their loved one's murderer from facing justice. He pulled out more documents, spreading them like accusations across his desk. But Assata Shakur isn't your only questionable friend in Cuba. Let's talk about your relationship with Fidel Castro himself. Kennedy displayed photographs, damning in their warmth and familiarity. Waters shaking hands with Castro. Waters sitting with Castro at a dinner. Waters smiling broadly next to a man responsible for thousands of deaths. You praised Castro's social policies. You thanked him for providing sanctuary to people you called political refugees, but whom the FBI calls terrorists and murderers. You called for an end to the U.S. embargo while Cuban dissidents rotted in prison. He listed Castro's crimes with prosecutorial precision. Fidel Castro's regime executed thousands of political prisoners, jailed journalists for decades, destroyed Cuba's economy through communist policies, ran a police state where speaking against the government could get you disappeared. Gay people were persecuted, sent to labor camps. Religious believers were oppressed. Families were torn apart. Kennedy held up photos of Cuban refugees on makeshift rafts, desperate people risking their lives to escape. While Cubans risked death on rafts to escape Castro's regime, you were shaking hands with him and smiling for cameras. While Cuban dissidents were being tortured in prison, you were praising his policies. While families mourned their executed loved ones, you were lobbying to end the pressure that might have forced reform. He pulled out another document, and his expression showed disgust. And let's not forget your claim that the CIA sold crack cocaine in black neighborhoods to fund covert operations. You made this accusation in 1996 based on a flawed newspaper series. You demanded investigations. You held hearings. You built part of your political brand on this conspiracy theory. Kennedy displayed the results of multiple investigations. The investigations found no evidence. Zero. The Justice Department investigated, found nothing. The CIA Inspector General investigated, found nothing. Even the newspaper that originally published the story backed away from it. But did you apologize for smearing an intelligence agency? Did you acknowledge you were wrong? No. You doubled down. You kept making the accusation. You fundraised off it. You used it to build your reputation as someone willing to speak truth to power, even though you were speaking lies. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound disappointment. So let me understand your moral framework, Congresswoman, and maybe you can help this simple country lawyer make sense of it. A cop killer living in luxury in Cuba, protected by a communist dictator. She's a political activist who deserves protection. The communist dictator himself, a man who murdered thousands of his own people. He's worth praising and defending. The CIA, despite multiple investigations finding no evidence. They're drug dealers destroying black communities. Kennedy's voice rose slightly. But people who entered the Capitol on January 6th, they're terrorists who should never see freedom again. The police officers they allegedly threatened, they deserve complete protection under the law. But Trooper Werner Forrester, who actually was murdered, his family doesn't deserve justice because his killer has the right politics. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. That's not a moral framework, Congresswoman. That's moral bankruptcy. That's deciding that justice depends entirely on whether you agree with someone's political views. And that makes you unfit to chair any committee, let alone one with as much power as financial services. Kennedy pulled out his reading glasses and put them back on, his folksy manner returning, but now it felt like a weapon being unsheathed rather than a disguise. You know what really gets me, Congresswoman? You use your famous phrase, reclaiming my time. You say it to cut people off, to assert your authority, to control the narrative. It's become your signature move, your catchphrase, turned into memes and merchandise. His voice dropped to almost a whisper, but in the silence of the room, everyone heard every word. But Trooper Werner Forrester had his time stolen, all of it. Every second he should have had with his children, every birthday, every graduation, every wedding. The grandchildren he never got to meet, the retirement he never got to enjoy, all of it stolen by a bullet fired by someone you call a political activist. Kennedy's eyes were wet now, genuine emotion breaking through the prosecutorial exterior. You can't reclaim time for Trooper Forrester. Assata Shakur took all his time, every last second of it, and you help her keep it by protecting her from justice, by lobbying foreign dictators on her behalf, by calling her a hero instead of what she is, which is a convicted cop killer. Waters tried to respond, her voice breaking. Assata was denied a fair trial. She was framed by a racist. She was convicted by a jury. Kennedy interrupted, his voice hard again. She exhausted all her appeals. Every court that reviewed the case, every judge who looked at the evidence upheld the conviction. But facts don't matter to you, do they, Congresswoman? What matters is your narrative, your politics, your fundraising base. Justice isn't blind in your world. Justice sees race, sees politics, sees who's on your team and who isn't. He closed that folder with a definitive thud and opened his final one, the thickest of all. And now, let's bring this all together. Let's talk about where all this corruption and all this selective justice has led you. Let's talk about your mansion while your constituents sleep in tents. Kennedy stood up for the first time in the hearing. He was taller than he looked sitting down, and his posture was straighter than his folksy demeanor had suggested. He was no longer pretending to be anything other than what he was, a former prosecutor, an Oxford-educated lawyer, a man who had spent months preparing for this moment. Congresswoman Waters, you've accused me today of being out of touch with working people. You've talked about your humble roots, your rise from poverty. You've mocked my education, my accent, my state. You've made a career out of claiming to represent the poor and the powerless. He pulled up an aerial photograph that filled the screen. This is your house, Congresswoman, Hancock Park, Los Angeles, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city. Purchased in 2004 for $2.8 million. Current estimated value $4.5 to $5 million. 6 bedrooms, 5,600 square feet, pool, separate guest house, gated entrance, professional landscaping. The photograph rotated, showing the mansion from multiple angles, each view more opulent than the last. Property taxes alone are over $40,000 a year. Maintenance and upkeep conservatively estimated at another $100,000 annually. This is not a modest home, Congresswoman. This is a mansion. This is wealth. Kennedy pulled up a financial chart, and his tone became that of an accountant presenting an audit. Congressional salary today is $174,000 a year. You've been in Congress since 1991. That's 33 years. In the early years, the salary was less, around $130,000. Even being generous and averaging it out, your total congressional salary over your career is approximately $5.7 million before taxes. He did the calculation on screen, showing each step. Federal income tax, state income tax, local taxes, Medicare, Social Security. You're in the highest tax brackets, so you're probably taking home about 55 to 60% of that gross income. That means roughly $3.1 to $3.4 million over 33 years. That's your net congressional income after taxes. Kennedy pulled up property records. But you bought this $2.8 million house in 2004. That's just 13 years into your congressional career. Even if you never spent a single dollar on food, clothing, travel, or anything else, which obviously you did, you couldn't have saved enough for a $2.8 million house from congressional salary alone. He displayed a mortgage document. To buy this house, conventional lending standards would require at least a 20% down payment. That's $560,000. In 2004, your congressional salary was about $158,000 a year, even if you somehow saved every penny for 3 or 4 years, which is mathematically impossible given that you have to pay for basic living expenses. You couldn't have made that down payment from salary alone. Kennedy turned to face Waters directly. So where did the money come from, Congresswoman? When she didn't answer, just sat there staring at the table, he provided a timeline, each date appearing on the screen with accompanying financial records. 2003, your daughter Corinne Waters' company Progressive Connections starts receiving major payments from your campaign. First year, $123,000. 2004, you purchased the mansion for $2.8 million. Same year, your husband Sidney joins the board of One United Bank. 2005 through 2008, One United board position continues. Your husband's stock holdings grow. 2008, you arrange the One United bailout. Your husband's stock investment is saved from becoming worthless. 2009 through present, Corinne Waters receives over $1.5 million more from your campaigns. Timeline appeared on screen like a prosecutor's murder board, dates and dollar amounts connecting in an intricate web. It's a pattern, Congresswoman. Every time your family needs money, there's a convenient arrangement through your political position. Your daughter gets campaign contracts at inflated rates. Your husband gets on a bank board and then you arrange its bailout. Your grandson gets hired as your chief of staff at premium salary. It all flows through your office, through your power, through your position. Kennedy pulled up another image, a devastating split screen. On one side, Waters' mansion in all its glory, palm trees swaying, luxury cars visible in the driveway. On the other side, statistics and photographs from California's 43rd Congressional District. Your district, Congresswoman, the one you claim to represent with such passion. The numbers appeared one by one, each more damning than the last. Median household income, $39,000 a year. Poverty rate, 23%. Unemployment, 12%. Over 15,000 homeless people living on the streets. Some of the worst performing public schools in California. Crumbling infrastructure. Food deserts. Lack of basic services. The contrast was stark and impossible to ignore. Kennedy let it sit on the screen in silence for a full 30 seconds, letting everyone in the room and everyone watching absorb the disparity. But here's the really interesting part, he finally said, zooming in on a map of Los Angeles. Your mansion isn't even in your district. It's in Hancock Park, 15 miles away, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the entire city. You don't live with the people you represent. He pulled up census data showing the demographics and income levels of Hancock Park versus the 43rd District. Your neighbors are millionaires and billionaires. Their children go to private schools that cost $50,000 a year. They shop at Whole Foods and boutique stores. They drive Range Rovers and Mercedes. That's your world, Congresswoman. Not the world of your constituents who are struggling to afford rent, who send their children to failing schools, who work 2 jobs and still can't make ends meet. Kennedy pulled out one final document, and his voice carried the weight of final judgment. Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. True, we discussed them earlier, but I want to be very clear about what they found because it's important. He displayed their reports chronologically. 2005. Representative Waters has used her position to direct millions of dollars to an organization run by her family members while her constituents' needs go unmet. 2006. Representative Waters again used her position to financially benefit her family, raising serious questions about her commitment to the people she represents. 2009. Representative Waters' intervention on behalf of One United Bank raises profound questions about her commitment to ethical standards and her fitness to chair any committee. 2011. Representative Waters continues to blur the line between her official duties and her family's financial interests. Kennedy set down the reports with deliberate care. 4 times, not 1, not 2, 4 separate times over 6 years, a respected nonpartisan watchdog organization documented a pattern of corruption. They laid out the evidence. They showed how you enriched your family. They demonstrated how you used your position for personal gain. And what happened? Nothing. You're still in Congress, still chairing one of the most powerful committees, still living in your mansion while your constituents live in poverty. He walked closer to the witness table, and when he spoke, his voice carried the accumulated weight of everything he'd presented. Congresswoman Waters, I've been in public service for a long time. I've seen politicians who genuinely care about their constituents. I've seen people who make real sacrifices to serve. I've seen public servants who remember where they came from and never forget the people they represent. His voice hardened. And I've seen people who use public office as a vehicle for personal enrichment while wrapping it all in the language of social justice. People who use their race as a shield against legitimate criticism. People who cry racism every time someone questions their actions. People who have turned public service into a family business. Kennedy's tone became almost sorrowful. You've spent 33 years in Congress, Congresswoman, 33 years representing some of the poorest people in America, and after 33 years your district is still poor. Your constituents still struggle. Homelessness has gotten worse, not better. The schools are still failing. Unemployment is still high. The infrastructure is still crumbling. He spread his hands. But the Waters family is doing great. Your daughter is a millionaire from campaign contracts. Your husband has profited handsomely from consulting arrangements with firms you regulate. Your grandson has made well over $1 million in salary. And you live in a mansion worth millions of dollars in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Los Angeles, 15 miles from the poverty you claim to fight. Kennedy returned to his seat, but he remained standing, his hands resting on the folders that contained the evidence of years of corruption. "You called me out of touch this morning, Congresswoman. You mocked my accent, my education, my state. You said I keep Louisiana poor and ignorant. You suggested I was some kind of racist overseer." His voice was quiet but carried perfectly in the silent room. "Well, Congresswoman, let's talk about those numbers. Louisiana's poverty rate is 18.6%. Your district's poverty rate is 23%. Louisiana's median household income is $52,000. Your district's is $39,000. Louisiana is investing billions in education reform. Your district's schools are ranked among the worst in California. I'd say you're not in a position to lecture anyone about keeping people poor." He picked up all his folders, the physical weight of the evidence clear. "These documents contain evidence of financial corruption, conflicts of interest, campaign finance violations, using your office to enrich your family, potential tax evasion, and a pattern of behavior spanning over 2 decades. I'm submitting all of this to the Department of Justice for investigation. I'm also forwarding copies to the House Ethics Committee, the Federal Election Commission, and the IRS." Waters finally found her voice, weak and desperate. "This is a political hit job. This is targeting. You're attacking me because I'm a powerful black woman who speaks truth to power and who—" "No, ma'am," Kennedy interrupted, his voice firm but not loud. "I'm holding you accountable because you're a corrupt politician who has used race as a shield while robbing the very people you claim to represent. Your race doesn't make you immune to scrutiny. Your position doesn't put you above the law, and your rhetoric doesn't erase your actions." He looked around the hearing room, addressing not just Waters but everyone present and everyone who would watch later. "For decades, Congresswoman Waters has lectured us about justice, about helping the poor, about standing up to corruption and the powerful. She's made herself into a symbol, a voice for the voiceless, a champion of the downtrodden. But when we actually look at what she's done, when we follow the money, when we examine her actions instead of listening to her words, we see something very different." Kennedy's voice rose slightly, filled with righteous anger. "We see a politician who enriched her family while her constituents stayed poor. We see someone who protected cop killers while condemning police officers. We see someone who praised communist dictators while wrapping herself in the American flag. We see someone who incited violence and harassment and then condemned others for far less. We see someone who used her position for personal gain and called it public service. We see someone who has turned representation into a lucrative family business." His voice dropped to that quiet, devastating tone again. "In Louisiana, we have an old saying, you can't get clean by pointing at everyone else's dirt. Congresswoman Waters has spent 33 years pointing at everyone else's dirt, calling everyone else corrupt, accusing everyone else of not caring about the poor. But all the while, she was rolling around in her own dirt, enriching herself and her family while the people she supposedly represented suffered." Kennedy addressed the chairman. "Mr. Chairman, I move that we forward all of these materials to the appropriate authorities for investigation. The American people deserve to know how their representatives are using their positions. The people of California's 43rd District deserve to know why their representative lives in a mansion while they struggle to survive. And Trooper Werner Forrester's family deserves to know why a sitting member of Congress has spent years protecting their loved one's murderer from justice." Waters stood up shakily, her lawyer supporting her by the elbow. Her face had gone from confident to ashen over the course of the hearing. For the first time in her long career, the woman who had built her reputation on never backing down, on reclaiming her time, on being the loudest voice in any room, had nothing to say. No comeback, no deflection, no attack, just silence. As she left the hearing room, Kennedy sat back down, putting his reading glasses back on, and returning to his yellow legal pad as if nothing particularly significant had happened. But everyone in that room knew something momentous had just occurred. The Gator had finally met her match. The woman who had terrorized opponents with accusations of racism, who had built a career on playing the victim while enriching herself, had been systematically dismantled by a man she dismissed as a country bumpkin. The video of the hearing went viral within hours. Not Waters's planned social media assault on Kennedy, Those tweets were deleted almost immediately, but the full footage of her systematic takedown. Multiple clips were shared millions of times. Waters exposed. Corruption revealed. The gator gets caught. The hashtags trended worldwide for days. Within a week, the Department of Justice announced a formal investigation into Waters' financial dealings. The announcement was brief but significant, noting that the investigation would examine potential violations of federal law including bank fraud, campaign finance violations, bribery, and honest services fraud. The FBI raided both her district office in Los Angeles and her Washington office, removing boxes of documents, computers, and financial records. Agents were seen carrying out materials for hours. The IRS announced an audit of Waters' personal finances going back 15 years. Tax experts noted this was highly unusual and suggested serious irregularities had been flagged. One United Bank's former CEO, Kevin Cohey, facing his own legal troubles, agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution. His testimony, legal experts predicted, would be devastating. Sidney Williams's consulting clients were all subpoenaed. Several immediately terminated their relationships with him, not wanting to be associated with the growing scandal. Karen Waters' progressive connections had its bank accounts frozen pending investigation. The company's offices were raided, and employees were questioned by federal agents. But perhaps the most dramatic fallout came from Waters' own district. The first town hall after the hearing erupted in anger. Constituents who had supported Waters for decades stood up and demanded answers. Whereas our 4.5 million became a rallying cry that echoed through South Los Angeles. Community leaders who had defended Waters through previous controversies called for her resignation. A recall petition gathered 40,000 signatures in 10 days, and organizers predicted they'd have enough to force a vote within weeks. Her approval rating in her own district collapsed from 71% to 34% in a single month. 3 challengers announced primary campaigns, and one, a young community organizer who'd grown up in Watts, raised $2 million in the first week. The message was clear. Waters' own constituents had turned against her. The House Ethics Committee, under intense pressure from both parties and facing public outrage, was forced to reopen its investigation. The committee announced it would examine not just the One United situation, but Waters' entire financial history. The 2 attorneys who had been fired from the original investigation were invited to testify about what they'd found and why they'd been removed. Nancy Pelosi, who had defended Waters for years, released a carefully worded statement that amounted to abandonment. These are serious allegations that require serious investigation. Every member of Congress, regardless of seniority or position, must be held to the highest ethical standards. No one is above accountability. The Congressional Black Caucus split publicly for the first time in years. Some members continued to defend Waters, calling the investigation racist and politically motivated. But others, particularly younger members, quietly told reporters it was time for new leadership. "We can fight for justice and also have integrity," one member said on Background. The 2 things aren't mutually exclusive. Some of us are tired of defending the indefensible. Even some of Waters' longtime media allies couldn't defend her when presented with the evidence Kennedy had compiled. Cable news hosts who had regularly featured Waters as a voice of moral authority fell silent or offered weak deflections. When pressed on the specifics, the One United bailout, the campaign payments to her daughter, the protection of Assata Shakur, they had no good answers. 6 months later, federal indictments were expected imminently. Legal experts following the case estimated Waters faced potential charges on multiple counts: bank fraud related to the One United situation, campaign finance violations related to her daughter's company, honest services fraud for using her position to benefit her family, ethics violations, and potentially tax evasion if her reported income didn't match her lifestyle. If convicted on all counts, she could face 20 years in federal prison. Her mansion in Hancock Park went up for sale, listed at $4.7 million. Real estate agents noted the irony that the listing emphasized the home's distance from the poorer neighborhoods of South Los Angeles. Waters was reportedly looking at properties in Maryland, far from California and her constituents. Her position as chair of the Financial Services Committee was in jeopardy. Democratic leadership made it clear that if she were indicted, she would be forced to step down. Even without an indictment, there was talk of replacing her with someone untainted by scandal. Her influence, built over 3 decades, was evaporating almost overnight. As for Senator John Kennedy, he returned to Louisiana to a hero's welcome. Conservative groups praised him for taking down one of the most vocal progressive voices in Congress. But interestingly, many moderates and even some liberals quietly expressed appreciation for what he'd done. Corruption is corruption, one Democratic operative said anonymously. We can't excuse it just because someone says the right things about social justice. Kennedy himself downplayed his role. The following Saturday morning, he was spotted at his favorite fishing spot on the bayou, teaching his grandson how to tie a lure. The morning mist rose off the water, cypress trees stood like sentinels, and the only sounds were birds and the gentle lap of water against the boat. When a reporter tracked him down, Kennedy just smiled that gentle smile, the same one he'd worn in the hearing. Sometimes the biggest gators think they can't be caught, he said, casting his line into the murky water with practiced ease. They get comfortable, arrogant even. They forget that there are always bigger predators in the swamp. They think they own the whole bayou, that they can do whatever they want without consequences. He reeled in slowly, the line cutting through the morning mist. But every gator meets their match eventually. Sometimes it's another gator. Sometimes it's a hunter. And sometimes, he chuckled softly, it's just a simple country lawyer with a fishing line and a lot of patience. The line went taut. Something had taken the bait. Kennedy's expression didn't change, but his hands worked with expert precision, setting the hook, beginning the careful process of reeling in his catch. Justice moves slow in these waters, he said, his attention on the fight playing out beneath the surface. Sometimes it feels like it's not moving at all. Good people start to lose faith, start to think the corrupt ones always win. He worked the reel steadily, neither too fast nor too slow. But it moves. Eventually, it always moves. You just have to be patient. You have to do your homework, you have to build your case piece by piece. And then, when the moment is right, you set the hook. The fish broke the surface, a large bass fighting hard. Kennedy brought it in with practiced skill, lifting it from the water and holding it up briefly before releasing it back. Catch and release today. Some fights are about the principle, not the prize. Back in Washington, Maxine Waters sat in her office, surrounded by lawyers, staring at the criminal referral documents spread across her desk. Her phone wasn't ringing with offers of support. The colleagues who used to seek her endorsement were now distancing themselves. Her social media mentions, once filled with praise, were now brutal. Her staff was quietly updating their resumes and reaching out to other offices. For 33 years, she had used her position to enrich her family while lecturing others about justice and inequality. For 33 years, she had protected cop killers while condemning law enforcement. For 33 years, she had incited violence and then condemned it when it came from her opponents. For 33 years, she had lived in luxury while her constituents suffered in poverty. And she had gotten away with all of it by playing the victim, by accusing anyone who questioned her of racism, by wrapping her corruption in the language of social justice and racial equity. But John Kennedy had done something no one else had been willing to do. He had pulled back the curtain. He had shown the receipts, document by document, date by date, dollar by dollar. He had connected the dots in a way that even her most loyal supporters couldn't ignore or explain away. He had made it impossible to dismiss the evidence as racism or political persecution, because the evidence spoke for itself. In the bayou, they say you can't outrun the truth. You can avoid it for a while, distract from it, deflect attention to something else. But eventually, if someone is patient enough and thorough enough, the truth catches up. Maxine Waters was learning that lesson the hard way, and the truth was unforgiving. And somewhere in Louisiana, Senator Kennedy was cleaning his morning catch, thinking about what to have for dinner, his work done for now. But he knew there were other gators in other swamps, other corrupt politicians who thought they were untouchable. The folders were already being compiled. The research was already underway. Justice moved slowly, but it moved. And John Kennedy was a very patient man. The Appropriations Committee hearing had lasted 3 hours, but the consequences would last years. Waters's career was effectively over, whether she officially resigned or not. Her legacy, which she'd carefully cultivated as a champion of the poor and voiceless, was now forever tainted by evidence of corruption and hypocrisy. The mansion, the family enrichment schemes, the protection of a cop killer, the incitement of violence, it would all be mentioned in the same breath as her name from now on. For Kennedy, it was another successful prosecution, just in a different venue. He'd spent months preparing, just as he had for trials decades ago. Every document verified, every claim sourced, every number checked and double-checked. He'd known Waters would attack him personally, would try to make it about race and region and education. He'd let her, had even encouraged it with his Country Boy Act, because he knew it would make the evidence more devastating when he finally revealed it. In chess, they call it a sacrifice. You give up a piece, let your opponent think they're winning, and then spring the trap. Kennedy had sacrificed his dignity for 3 hours, letting Waters mock and belittle him, because he knew what was coming. And when it came, when he opened those folders and started presenting evidence, the contrast between her bombast and his facts was devastating. The hearing became required viewing in law schools as an example of effective cross-examination and evidence presentation. Political science professors used it to discuss ethics in government and the importance of oversight. Communications experts analyzed what went wrong with Waters's strategy and how Kennedy had controlled the narrative despite appearing to be the victim. But for the people of California's 43rd Congressional District, the lessons were more personal and more painful. They had trusted Waters for over 3 decades. They had defended her against criticism. They had believed she was fighting for them. And all along, she had been fighting for herself and her family, using their poverty as a shield for her enrichment, using their struggles as a backdrop for her political theater. The betrayal cut deep. Town halls became forums for anger and pain. How could she live in a mansion while we sleep in cars? How could she pay her daughter millions while our schools crumble? How could she claim to represent us when she doesn't even live in our district? The questions hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable, because there were no good answers. There was no justification. There was only the cold, hard truth that Kennedy had laid out in that hearing room, document by document, dollar by dollar, lie by lie. And as the sun set over Louisiana, Kennedy sat on his porch, a glass of sweet tea beside him, watching the stars come out over the bayou. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new work. But tonight, justice had been served. The truth had come to light. And somewhere in California, a community was beginning the hard work of healing and demanding better from those who claimed to represent them. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the destruction of one corrupt politician's career, but the message it sent to all the others. The message that no one is above accountability, no matter how long they've served or how loudly they claim to represent the marginalized. The message that eventually, patient people with evidence and determination will expose the truth. The gator had been caught, and the bayou was a little bit cleaner for it.